So good morning, everybody. We have our first speaker with us, Mr. Daniel, and he'll be talking about documentation-driven development lessons from Django project. So let's invite him for his talk. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks very much for being here. I'm very grateful to have the invitation to speak to you at this PyCon. I'll quickly introduce myself to you. My name is Daniele Procida. I work for Divio, a Swiss software company, as I'm the community and documentation manager for the company. I'm also a board member of the Django Software Foundation and a core developer of the Django project. At Divio, one of the things I work on is our open source Django-based CMS, Django CMS, which is the best known content management system in the Django world. You can reach me on my email address. I'm on GitHub and Twitter and IRC under EvilDMP if you want to find me. We're sponsoring this conference as Django CMS, so we've got a booth downstairs. If you're at all interested in web content management with Python, come and see us. I have some colleagues there. We've come all the way from Ukraine, Switzerland, or in my case from the UK, and from North Carolina too. Hello. Oh, okay. Should I unhook this one? Swiss chocolate or talk about content management with us. I'm interested in documentation. Some people take quite seriously the idea that you should write your documentation first and that your code should follow. But this idea of documentation-driven development is not nearly as commonly discussed or practiced as test-driven development, which I'm sure you've all heard of. In fact, I've never actually heard anyone speak about documentation-driven development, never mind met anyone who says they actually practice it in a very rigorous way. And I don't want to spend too much time here, but just to briefly introduce it, documentation-driven development reverses the typical priority of code and documentation. So you start with the documentation instead of the code, and instead of documenting your code, you code your documentation. So documentation-driven development, like test-driven development, puts what should be before what is. It establishes a shared, easily accessible, higher-level overview of the work in hand. It provides a shared, easily accessible metric of success. It importantly encourages contribution and engagement from non-programmers. And it binds the programming, or binds the whole development effort into a coherent narrative. Now, I don't actually know very much about documentation-driven development, but I'm sure it's a valuable development discipline that more people should adopt. And in fact, what I want to talk about is not this discipline, but some other senses in which documentation drives development. So let's have a look at Django, which is what I do and what I know best, and let's consider what documentation has meant for the Django project. And the first thing to say, not because it's some new observation, but because everybody seems to agree with this, is that Django's documentation is exemplary. I've not come across any other project of a similar type with better or even remotely as good as documentation. And it's perhaps simply that my experience is limited, but I haven't met anyone else who's found anything better than Django's documentation either. What is so good about Django's documentation? Well, first, it's structured properly into different sections, tutorials, how-tos, reference, and topics. We can discuss the implications of this. We'll come back to this later, so don't worry about that now. Within its structure, it's extremely clear and consistent. In other words, its structure is not only respected, but its style and content are easy to follow, and the usage remains consistent across its structure. The documentation of Django covers just about everything there is to know about Django, so it's very complete. And it's held to the highest standards. In order to get a contribution in Django's documentation accepted, you have to work as hard on it as you would if you were working on its code. And last 2 points get more important, I think. It exemplifies important values of clarity, courtesy, and friendliness for the whole community. And finally, documentation in Django is regarded as a process rather than a product. And we'll come back to this as well later, because that's the most important, I think. So, what effects do all these characteristics of Django's documentation have? Some of them are simply quite obvious. It makes Django easier to learn and to adopt. It makes people who use Django better Django programmers. It lowers the support version for people who are helping new or puzzled users of it. And it makes the development of Django itself easier and smoother and faster. In short, Django's documentation, without any doubt, is good for Django. And here we come to the main point of my talk, which is that software is not the only thing that develops and grows and improves. Programmers and communities of programmers also grow and develop and improve. And they, programmers and communities of programmers, are what makes the software develop. So the question that I'm particularly interested in is, what does documentation mean for the development of communities and programmers? We'll look at communities first. As you've gathered, I'm kind of playing on different senses of the word develop here. So keep that thought, as they say. So many of these terms, we focus on one meaning of them, and they have other meanings. They've come from other places, and those meanings still have value and use. Django's community, like its software, is stable, mature, and dependable, a bit like me. You know where you are with Django's community, just like you know where you are with its software on the whole. Not too many unexpected surprises. The community is active, it's engaged, and it's remarkably united. It has difficulties, but it tends not to have huge crises or lingering ills. And it's my contention that one of the glues that has bound Django's community together is its documentation. So I think that when it comes to the development of the community, Django's documentation does 4 very important things. One, I said earlier that Django's documentation represents its attitudes, but I think it's stronger still than that. The care that Django's documentation takes, the care that Django takes with its documentation is an implicit contract with its community of users. It's a commitment to standards of communication and information. And the 4th most important thing is that documentation in Django is treated, as I said earlier, an activity rather than a product. So it's an activity, not just content. It's a process, not just a product. And I think that's the deepest of those points, so I'll start with that. Have you ever hesitated to ask for help with a programming question, for example, on IRC, because you felt that the answer was already out there, if only you knew how to find it or maybe how to understand it, but you hesitated from asking it because you felt that you might be invited, possibly with some irritation, to read the fucking manual? Yeah? Has anybody felt hesitant in doing that? Yeah. And to be invited to, told dismissively to go and read the documentation by somebody who thought you were being just lazy or stupid. And you might be right to hesitate, because people can be remarkably forgetful about how they learnt things once they've learnt them. And they can be remarkably forgetful about what it was like not to know those things, as if they were born knowing how to use a certain function or something. So people are not always sympathetic and friendly to people who don't yet know the things that they do. Maybe you've had another experience. You've asked a question, and someone has replied with a link to this sarcastic, "Let me Google that for you" website. Well, I detest this website, and I hate everything it stands for, because it stands for putting people down who are asking for help in understanding something and telling them that the reason that they don't understand what they want to know is that they are too stupid or lazy to learn it. They're not good enough to learn it. So I think this is a symbol of something quite unpleasant in certain parts of our programming culture. So insofar as information and documentation are considered to be content, it's possible to think and respond in those ways. The content's out there. It's freely available if you have an internet connection. Go ahead, help yourself. And if you can't do that properly, that's your problem. Other people have managed, so if you can't, there must be something wrong with you. That's only possible if we regard information and documentation as stuff. But if you understand that, or if you understand information as the process of informing, as an activity, and understand documentation as the process of documenting, then this response is less possible. And in fact, we see that kind of response much less in Django, and also in Python, actually, than is seen in many other programming cultures. Our IRC channels and email lists are friendly places where the experts of the community regard information and documentation as activities that they engage in, not as stuff that other people ought to have read instead of wasting everyone else's time. So I think that that understanding has a tangible difference. So information in this model is regarded as communicative transactions between agents. If you were at Professor Barba's keynote talk yesterday, this is exactly what she was talking about how communicative transactions work between agents, between people who are exchanging things, because you don't put a slab of information out there and there's the information, help yourself to it. There is a process which feeds back. information in this model demands that we respect values of clarity, intelligibility, relevance, comprehension, attention to the needs and abilities of the other party, affirmation of mutual understanding. So I have to understand that you've understood, and so on. And when you're doing that, you can't pretend that you're informing people by telling them to read the fucking manual or sarcastically Googling things for them. So good documentation shows respect. In software, good documentation and a default position that if someone doesn't understand it, then the problem must lie in the documentation rather than the person who doesn't understand, becomes a sign of respect, an expression of those values. Django's documentation sets standards, expectations, and the tone for communication, especially for communication with less expert users of it. And it's an assertion of values that are subsequently reflected across the Django community. And what this means, I think, is that in this community, in some contexts at least, we do think of information as the activity of informing, something that we do rather than as a collection of content. And that this idea of information, this way of thinking about it, has had real meaningful and beneficial consequences for people who use Django. And I'm sometimes reminded of this when I speak to people outside my cozy world of Django, because my job title is documentation and or community and documentation manager. And sometimes people ask me, other programs ask me what you do. I say, oh, I'm a documentation manager. And they look at me with a kind of embarrassment and horror, so I've admitted to doing something very unmanly or something that I should be a little bit ashamed about rather than having it printed on a business card. When I tell this to people in the Python or Django communities, their response is, oh, that's cool. So there's an understanding of the meaning of documentation in our community that does definitely not exist elsewhere. So I said that Django's documentation has been good for Django, but really I think it's been much more than merely good. To inform something literally means to shape something, to press a shape into it. That's what informing means. And Django's documentation literally informs, shapes its community. It has determined, it has informed how the community has developed, what sort of thing it has developed into. And it's one of the things that continues to drive the development of Django as a community. So that's the kind of development that I'm speaking of when I talk about documentation-driven development. And documentation has similar implications for programmers too. Developers develop, which is to say their programming skills develop, get better, improve. And the question for many programmers and their employers and the people they work with is, how do I develop? How do I become a better programmer? And it's a true but pretty uninteresting observation that good Django documentation helps Django developers write better code. But in fact, I think documentation has much wider implications than that. Documentation is an excellent way for newcomers to start contributing to open source software. You don't need to be an expert in something to be able to identify something clear or lacking in its documentation and suggest a way to improve it. So writing documentation represents an easy step, an easy progress to the next step from being a user of something to being a contributor to it. Documentation is almost always welcome. In fact, in most projects, not in Django, in most projects, it's not so much welcome as desperately needed, and it's far easier in most projects to get documentation accepted than, for example, a new feature. And finally, explaining something to someone else is just about the best possible way to explain it to oneself, to learn and understand it. So if part of a programmer's development is to contribute and to understand more, documentation is an ideal way to do this. And the Django project really does get all this. Django's documentation structure guides and encourages new contributions and contributors. In Django, the clarity of the documentation structure makes it almost obvious how and where and what to write for a particular section, just like well-written code does. And this works just the same for very large contributions, like, say, an entire new section in the tutorial, as it does for tiny ones, like an improved explanation of some function or class. In Django, contributions to documentation are taken extremely seriously and held to the highest standard. This means that contributions and contributors receive as much engagement and support as those to code. In many other projects, documentation is so desperately needed that almost any contribution will be accepted just because it's documentation and someone cared enough to write it. In Django, documentation goes through the same ringer that code goes through, and that ringer turns out to be somebody called Tim Graham, who has the patience of a saint and is willing to bat back a documentation contribution multiple times over a long period to its author until it's in precisely the shape that it needs to be before it's ready to go in. Contributions and the contributors who make them to Django's documentation are highly valued and recognized. The members of Django's core team are people who have made substantial contributions to Django. Mine have mine have all been contributions to documentation. So Django really does offer a way for people to advance in the community through documentation. And of course, documenting code is the best possible way to understand it. And I think that's the most important of these things, that Django encourages developers to write documentation, which means that its own developers understand its code better still. And almost everybody seems to recognize and agree with this, but remarkably few people behave as though they believed it, so something needs to be done about that. All of this means that Django not only gets more and better contributions to its documentation than other projects do, it also advances the skills, confidence, and usefulness of the developers who contribute to it. If you want to learn how to contribute to open source software in Python, there's hardly a better way to start doing it than by doing some work on Django's documentation. So this is what I mean when I say that Django does documentation-driven development. I mean that through its documentation, it develops, advances, improves its community and its developers, quite apart from its code. So those are the lessons from Django. What can your open source project do to reap some of the same rewards from its documentation? Well, I don't think it's something that can be accomplished overnight. Much of this is to do with attitudes, and attitudes are notoriously hard things to change. But all the same, some of the steps you can take are quite easy, and I think that if you keep taking them in the right direction, eventually attitudes will follow. So firstly, you can structure your documentation correctly into tutorials, how to reference topics. If you look at the very first page of the Django documentation, it explains why we have this structure. People get these muddled up, especially they get muddled up between tutorials and how-to documents. I'm not sure if, how many minutes do I have left? I have 3 minutes, okay, so I won't spend, we can talk about that afterwards, okay. I can explain those in more detail. Make your contribution policies for documentation as rigorous as those for your code. Don't be afraid to bat back documentation to its contributors. Take the contributors and the contributions seriously. You wouldn't accept substandard code from someone. Don't accept substandard documentation. People, even if it irritates them a bit at first to have things sent back, do appreciate being taken seriously and appreciate that the things they're contributing might be so important that they have to be got exactly right. Substandard code can only hurt your applications, but substandard documentation is detrimental to the entire community. Document your documentation. Make sure it's clear what the policies are, what you want from each section of it. Value your documentation contributors. Recognize them publicly. Value the activity of documentation and information. Set aside time for it. If you, that's what your project can do. What about you personally or your organization? Well, if you're really serious about this, there are some things you can definitely do, real commitments that you can make. Attend a Write the Docs meetup or conference. There was one last week here in Portland. There'll be one in September in Prague. Support Write the Docs, support Read the Docs. Excellent projects. Make being a documentation manager someone's role. Pay someone to have that responsibility. Spend money and time in your organization on documentation. And all of these will help you on the way to achieving the things on the previous page. So documentation is becoming a movement. There are more things I could talk about, and if I'm honest, a talk like this can only help let you know that such opportunities exist. The real point is that, as I say, documentation is becoming it's becoming a movement in Python and Django, partly thanks to the initial efforts of Django, partly thanks to the efforts of people like Eric Holscher behind Read the Docs and Write the Docs. We all benefit from documentation, our code, our communities, and our people. So take advantage of those opportunities and join in. Thank you very much. Do we have time for some questions? Oh, we've got time for one question. So if someone has a short question, please.
If somebody has a short question. Yeah.
What do you think of the concept that a lack of documentation can provide job security in a closed?
No, I don't buy that at all. I think the lack of documentation just gets in the way of everyone and everything. Yeah, I think that would be a completely specious argument. Don't pin your hopes on that. Before we go, that's where you can find me. Come and visit us at the Django CMS booth. And just one last thing, if you look closely on there, you'll see that, according to the television, I am actually Python software. So, thank you very much. Pleased to talk to you later.
Thank you.